This is MTG Burgeoning, and in this video we are going to update and upgrade our Kozilek the Great Distortion EDH deck. Thank you for joining us for another installment of the Up and Up series. Today we are updating and upgrading Kozilek the Great Distortion. We have a half dozen cards going in, which means a half dozen cards are coming out. And we're going to start off with a bang here, folks, with Portal to Fxia. Here we have an artifact for 9 generic mana, and because of the way in which this deck is constructed, all colorless all day long, the mana rock ramp is unbelievable. We should never shy away from adding an artifact that costs 9 mana, particularly for what it can do. When Portal of Fxia enters the battlefield, each opponent sacrifices 3 creatures. Man, can you imagine if we're sitting down with 3 to 4 players? We are getting 9 to 12 creatures at most into those graveyards. That is amazing just for the 9 mana, but we're not done yet. At the beginning of our upkeep, we put target creature card from a graveyard onto the battlefield under our control. It's a Phyrexian in addition to its other types. This is such a needed ability for all colorless decks. We don't have this. This is not readily accessible in non-color decks, but boy oh boy, Portal to Phyrexia really makes that crack here. This instantly becomes one of the most powerful cards in the deck, and that's saying quite a lot because this deck is loaded with some colorless doozies. With the portal going in, we are going to take out another form of, well, I guess we could call this removal, because we know we've got the creature removal there with the enter the battlefield's forced sacrifice trigger. For that going in, we're going to take out Oblivion Stone. Now with this artifact, it has a mana value of 3. For 4, we can tap this and put a fate counter on target permanent. And then for 5, we can tap this and sacrifice it to destroy each non-land permanent without a fate counter on it, and then remove all fate counters from all permanents. This was always a risky play. This was always one of those last resort cards because, like I said just a moment ago, with all of the mana rocks that are inundating this build and hopefully on our side of the battlefield, we lose those too if they don't have fate counters put onto them by Oblivion Stone. So what we're really doing here is we're taking out a mass removal spell that certainly has an impact on our side of the battlefield for an artifact Portal of Phyrexia that only impacts in a negative way our opponent's sides of the battlefield through the forced sacrifice creature removal. And then at the beginning of each of our upkeeps, we get to pick a creature card from a graveyard, and we're putting that bad boy right onto the battlefield. Very, very easy swap here. Oblivion Stone out and Portal to Phyrexia in. And even if we were to assess that from a mana value perspective, the mana value of 9 is not that much higher than paying 3 for the mana value of Oblivion Stone and then paying 5 to tap it and sacrifice it. Very, very good change there, folks. All right, we're moving on to edition number 2. Calamity of the Titans. Here we have a colorless sorcery. Oh, we don't have many of these to add into this deck. Well, here's one that's going in there. Lock, stock, and barrel. 4 generic mana and 2 colorless mana. We don't have to worry about that distinction in this deck because every source of mana here is colorless. As an additional cost to cast the spell, we reveal a colorless creature card from our hand. That will not be a problem. We have a ton of Elrazi and a lot of artifact creatures, so we should not have any trouble paying this additional cost. And then we exile each creature and planeswalker with mana value less than the revealed card's mana value. So here we have a way in which to get rid of pretty much everything on our side. All creatures and planeswalkers from our opponent's sides of the battlefield, probably for ours too. I mean, we don't have a ton of creatures in this deck. This is not a creature-centric colorless build, but I think it's safe to assume that we may lose 1 or 2 depending on exactly what's out there. More importantly is here we have a board wipe that's going to affect our opponents much more than it's going to affect us. because we are going to have some massive creatures in our hands that should be able to get rid of any creature or planeswalker on our opponent's sides of the battlefield for just 6 mana. With that mass removal spell going in, coming out, it's going to be Perilous Vaults. Now here we had an artifact that costs 4 to cast and 5 to activate. So for the investment of 9 mana, we would exile Perilous Vault and then exile all non-land permanents. Similar to what we said about Oblivion Stone, this is also going to impact all of our mana rocks. And again, similar to Oblivion Stone, this was one of those artifacts that was last resort, just in case, break the glass and try to pick up the pieces after we exile it. But here we don't have to worry about that now, because with Perilous Vault leaving to make room for Calamity of the Titans, now we can focus on making sure that our opponent's sides of the battlefield are impacted much more through our removal than ours. All right, edition number 3 going in, and that is going to be Rise of the Elrazi. 9 and 3 colorless. This spell cannot be countered. We destroy target permanent. Target player draws 4 cards, and then we take an extra turn after this one, and then we exile Rise of the Elrazi upon resolution. So for a total of 12 mana, again, similar to what we said about our very first card, Portal to Phyrexia, in this video, we should not feel intimidated by a mana value of 12. The mana rocks that we have in this deck, the way in which we can ramp out so far ahead of our opponents, we should have very little trouble casting Rise of the Elrazi. And when we do, we pick a permanent on the battlefield to destroy it, we put 4 cards in our hand, take an extra turn, all for just 12 mana. This, we really could consider a potential win condition in this deck. With Rise of the Elrazi going in, the card coming out is Meteor Golem. Here we had an artifact creature, a golem, for 3/3 for just 7. I'm sorry, I shouldn't say for just 7 mana, because the investment of 7 mana into this seems to be pretty high, just for coming into play and destroying target non-land permanent an opponent controls. Well, for 5 more mana, we simply destroy target permanent. We put 4 cards into our hand and take an extra turn after this one. Meteor Golem gets absolutely swallowed up in the value comparison to Rise of the Elrazi. All right, halfway through this addition subtraction video of the Up and Up series, and edition number 4, it is, oh yes it is Desecration Reality. Here we have a colorless instant. Those babies are as rare as winter roses. For each opponent, we exile up to 1 target permanent that player controls with an even mana value. Keep in mind, lands have a mana value of 0, and 0 is an even cost. I'm sorry, I shouldn't say that 0 is an even cost. Even mana value, lands have a mana value of 0. They are 0, so you can tap. I'm sorry, let me back up here. I'm stumbling over all of my words because I'm just so excited about the colorless instant. So yes, we could pick off some lands with this spell, and they're just going to get straight exiled for 7 mana. As an additional bonus through its Adamant mechanic, if at least 3 colorless mana was spent to cast the spell, which, let's face it, that's always going to happen in this build, and then we can return a permanent card with an odd mana value from our graveyard to the battlefield. Maybe somebody popped off our Soul Ring, maybe somebody destroyed one of our 3 CMC mana rocks. Either way, we're going to impact our opponent's sides of the battlefield by exiling one of their permanents, and we're going to get one of ours back from the graveyard. And that's all for the cost of 7 mana. Oh, baby, what a great addition Desecration Reality is going to be in this build. With that colorless instant coming in, going out is going to be Lux Cannon. An artifact for 4, we had to tap to put a charge counter on it. We had to tap to remove 3 charge counters on it to destroy target permanent. The only problem here with Lux Cannon in this particular build is we are not a proliferate build. We are not a charge counter build. We just needed something to act in the way of some kind of direct removal. Well, here now we have Desecrate Reality, which, although the removal is a bit more limited than what we can get from Lux Cannon, it's going to be a lot quicker because we don't have to worry about loading this up with charge counters, removing charge counters, and then loading them up again. All right, our 5th card going in, and that card is going to be Darksteel Monolith. It's an indestructible artifact for 8 mana, and once each turn, we may pay 0 mana rather than pay the mana cost for a colorless spell that we cast from our hand. This is fantastic. This is let's face it, this is a much watered-down version of Omniscience, the oh-so-powerful blue enchantment. But we will take this we will take this card and throw it into our build every day of the week and twice on Friday Night Magic. Once during our turn, we're casting a spell from our hand for free. Every spell in this deck is colorless, and putting Darksteel Monolith on our side of the battlefield lets us cast one of them for free during each of our turns. With that wonderful artifact going in, it's going to take the place of Planar Bridge. Now here, the thought process was we could pay the 8 mana and tap Planar Bridge to activate it, to search our library for a permanent card and then put it onto the battlefield, which, I mean, there are definitely some permanent cards putting them onto the battlefield straight from our library that could have an immense impact on the game. The biggest probably being Eugen the Spirit Dragon. But again, with Darksteel Monolith, we don't have to worry about having to pay the 8 mana every turn. And that's, I shouldn't say 8 mana every turn, 8 mana to activate it. And that's on top of the 6 mana to do so. So although there are a few permanent spells there are a few permanent cards that are in our library that once they hit immediately could have an amazing impact. Next to Eugen, we're probably thinking potentially Blightsteel Colossus if we had a Lightning Greaves or some other way to give it haste or it could attack right away. We're maybe looking at a Darksteel Forge to give all of our artifacts indestructible. But more often than not, the permanent that we're going to put into play for 8 mana is not going to have as big as an immediate impact as if we were to cast it from our hand for free, particularly because of all of the cast triggers that we have from the Elrazi Titans, including the one from our own General. Keep that in mind, that the cards that are going into play from Planar Bridge are not being casted. They are going straight from the library into play. And yes, I understand that from Darksteel Monolith, the spell has to be cast from our hand. I put that on the wrong side. But we can get Kozilek into our hand. That's not impossible. All right, folks, here we go. One more card going into this Kozilek deck, and that's going to be the Wondrous Crucible. Here we have an artifact for 7 that gives permanents we control Ward 2, which means that if any spells or abilities our opponents control target any of our permanents, they need to pay 2 additional generic mana or they are countered. At the beginning of our end step, we mill 2 cards, and then we exile a non-land card at random from our graveyard. We copy it, and we cast the copy without paying its mana cost. That is amazing for us in this build. Now, granted, we're going to have probably a little bit of help to get some of these permanent cards into our graveyard from our side of the battlefield. I'm sure our opponents are going to have plenty of removal spells that'll pick off an artifact here and Elrazi there. But guess what? If we get Wondrous Crucible into play, we are going to have an ability to get them back. And even if we can't get the permanents from our side of the battlefield into the graveyard, that beginning of our upkeep mill 2 cards trigger will do the trick for us. Look at this. We are loading up such graveyard interaction in a true colorless deck that our opponents are not going to know what to do when they sit down at the table going up against Special K. All right, with Wondrous Crucible going in, we had to find a card to take out, and honestly, this one was a bit of a puzzler, because with Wondrous Crucible, we're adding protection to our permanents, and we are also adding a Graveyard Recursion ability, which, let's face it, that's pretty rare to find in an all-colorless deck. So we had to take a different route to find a card that was similar to Wondrous Crucible to replace it. So what we ended up doing is we decided to water down just so slightly our removal, and in so doing we decided to find a removal spell of the current 99, including the cards that were taken out, that seems to be the weakest removal spell to make way for this wonderful, wonderful Crucible. And that ended up being Predator Flagship. For the initial investment of 5 mana, we can pay 2 mana to give target creature flying until end of turn, and then we can pay 5 mana and tap this artifact to destroy target creature with flying. So in essence, we could pay a total of 7 mana to destroy target creature, because we can give the first 2 mana, we could pay the first 2 mana to give target creature flying, and then the last 5 mana and tap this to destroy that same creature. So instead of jumping through all of those hoops, and there were a couple of times that we did give one of our creatures flying, even though our general does have the menace built into the 12/12 huge body, we have had some flying Blightsteel Colossi? We'll say Blightsteel Colossuses in the past. But I think overall, if we were to kind of pair up Predator Flagship versus Wondrous Crucible, we are paying 7 mana one time, and at the beginning of our end step every single turn, we are going to have the ability to get a permanent card copied and put onto our side of the battlefield, versus using that 7 mana to potentially take out a creature that might be giving us any kind of trouble or problems on our opponent's sides of the battlefield. I think overall, the initial investment of 7, we're going to get a much more proactive bang for our buck than sitting back and waiting to be reactive by using Predator Flagship. All right, MTGBC, there you have it. Kozilek, the Great Distortion, another installment of the Up and Up series. You let me know your thoughts about these changes in the comment section below. This is MTG Burgeoning, your channel for all things Magic.